Welcome to Ironwad Whispers, your corner for stories that hit the heart and spark the imagination. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Share your city or country down in the comments. I'd love to know. And if you're ready for a journey filled with twists, turns, and emotions that'll keep you hooked till the very end, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Once upon a time, a young woman collapsed on the cold street of Kentucky, only to awaken in the protective arms of a powerful billionaire whose embrace would change her life forever. Susan Martinez pressed her hand against her temple as the world began to spin around her. The scorching Kentucky summer heat had been relentless all week, but today felt different, oppressive, suffocating. She'd been walking for 3 hours, going from one job interview to another, her last $20 spent on bus fare that morning. The rejection from her 5th interview that day echoed in her mind. "We'll call you if something opens up." They never called. Her vision blurred as she reached the corner of Lexington Avenue and 3rd Street. The last thing she remembered was the sidewalk rushing up to meet her face, the taste of copper in her mouth, and the distant sound of someone shouting. Then, nothing but darkness. Sweet, merciful darkness that promised relief from the hunger pangs that had been her constant companion for the past 3 days. Cox Willer had been walking out of the Beaumont Gallery when he saw her fall. Something about the way she crumpled, not dramatic or attention-seeking, but quiet and defeated, made him run faster than he had in years. By the time he reached her, a small crowd had gathered, everyone filming with their phones, but no one actually helping. He pushed through them, his designer suit scraping against the concrete as he knelt beside her. "Call 911. He barked at the nearest bystander, then gently turned Susan onto her back. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the harsh afternoon sun, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just one bad day. Cox cradled her head in his lap, using his suit jacket to shield her from the sun. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they were the color of honey in sunlight, confused and frightened. "You're safe," he whispered, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. "I've got you." Susan woke to the sound of machines beeping and the antiseptic smell that could only mean one thing: a hospital. Panic seized her immediately. She couldn't afford this. She couldn't afford anything. As she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness forced her back down, and she noticed him. A man in an expensive-looking shirt, sleeves rolled up, sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair like he belonged there. "The doctor said, 'You're severely dehydrated and malnourished,'" Cox said quietly, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" Susan turned away, embarrassment burning her cheeks. She didn't need some rich stranger's pity. "I should go," she mumbled, even though she had nowhere to go. Her landlord had changed the locks 2 days ago. Cox leaned forward, his green eyes serious. "The bill's been taken care of, all of it, and I'd like to offer you a job, if you're interested." "I don't need charity," Susan said, her pride warring with her desperation. She'd learned long ago that nothing in life came free, especially not from men who wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. Cox Willer. She recognized the name now. The shipping magnate whose fortune came from revolutionizing logistics technology wasn't known for his kindness. "It's not charity," Cox replied, pulling out his phone and showing her a photo. "This is my daughter, Emma. She's 7, brilliant, and absolutely hates every nanny I've hired. She needs someone real, someone who understands struggle and strength. The position pays $80,000 a year, plus room and board in the guest house." He paused, studying her face. "You'd be saving me, really." I'm at my wits' end. Susan looked at the photo. A little girl with Cox's green eyes, but sadder, lonelier. She saw herself in that expression, the look of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be cruel. The guest house on Cox's estate was bigger than any apartment Susan had ever lived in. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and windows that looked out onto gardens that seemed to stretch forever. She stood in the doorway with her single bag of possessions, feeling like an intruder in someone else's fairy tale. This had to be a dream, or worse, some elaborate scheme she hadn't figured out yet. Cox appeared behind her, carrying a box of what looked like groceries. "Emma's at school until 3, he said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "I thought you might want to settle in first. She can be intense." He seemed different here, less sure of himself, running his hand through his dark hair in a gesture she was already beginning to recognize as nervousness. Her mother died 3 years ago. Cancer. She hasn't really connected with anyone since then. The weight of his words hung between them, and Susan understood she wasn't just being hired as a nanny. She was being trusted with something precious and fragile. Emma Willow was nothing like the smiling child in the photograph. She stood in the doorway of the main house, arms crossed, giving Susan a look that could have frozen fire. "You're the new one," she said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact. The last one lasted 2 weeks. The one before that, 4 days. What makes you think you're different?" Susan knelt down to Emma's level, something none of the previous nannies had probably done. "Because I'm not here to be your friend or your mother," she said honestly. "I'm here because your dad offered me a job, and I needed one. We can be honest with each other, or we can pretend. Which would you prefer?" Emma's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the directness. "Honest," she said after a moment, her voice smaller. "Good," Susan replied. "Then honestly, I think we're both pretty angry at the world right now, and maybe that's okay." 3 weeks passed in careful navigation. Emma tested every boundary, from refusing to eat breakfast to hiding Susan's car keys. But Susan had grown up with younger siblings and chaos. She met each challenge with calm persistence. Cox watched from a distance, appearing only for rushed dinners where Emma would glare at her plate and Susan would fill the silence with questions about school. Everything changed the night of the thunderstorm. Susan found Emma crying in her closet, terrified of the lightning that reminded her of the machines in her mother's hospital room. Without thinking, Susan crawled into the closet with her, bringing a flashlight and her phone. "Want to see something?" she asked, pulling up a time-lapse video of flowers blooming. They sat there for an hour watching nature documentaries, until Emma fell asleep against Susan's shoulder. Cox found them there later, his expression unreadable as he carefully lifted his sleeping daughter and carried her to bed. "Thank you," Cox said simply the next morning, pouring Susan coffee in the kitchen before Emma woke up. She hasn't let anyone comfort her since. He trailed off, staring into his own mug. The early morning light caught the silver threading through his temples, making him look vulnerable in a way that billionaires probably weren't supposed to look. "She's a good kid," Susan replied, meaning it. "She just needs to know it's okay to feel things. You both do." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the overreach. But Cox didn't seem offended. Instead, he smiled, a real smile, not the practiced one he wore for business calls. "Is that your professional opinion, Miss Martinez?" There was a teasing note in his voice that made her stomach flutter, in a way that definitely wasn't part of her job description. "I need a favor," Cox announced one evening, looking uncomfortable in a way that involved a lot of tie adjusting. "There's a charity gala tomorrow night. Children's hospital funding. Emma insists on going, but only if you come too." He paused, then added quickly, as her nanny, of course. I'll pay overtime. Susan felt something sink in her chest. Of course it was about Emma. What else would it be? I don't have anything appropriate to wear to something like that, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Cox's face reddened slightly. I've taken the liberty of having some options sent to your house. Various sizes. You can return whatever doesn't work. The gesture was thoughtful and presumptuous in equal measure, so perfectly Cox that Susan didn't know whether to be touched or annoyed. The dress was midnight blue, simple but elegant, and it fit like it had been made for her. Susan stared at herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back. When had she last felt beautiful? Before her mother's medical bills? Before her father left? She couldn't remember. Emma burst into the guest house without knocking, then stopped short, her mouth forming a perfect O. You look like a princess, Emma breathed, then immediately scowled as if angry at herself for the admission. A pretty okay princess, she amended. Susan laughed, the sound surprising them both. Well, you look like a queen, she said, admiring Emma's green dress that matched her eyes. Shall we go shock your father? Emma grinned, a real smile that transformed her face. He's going to drop his phone, she predicted. She wasn't wrong. The gala was held at the Beaumont Hotel, the same building where Cox had first seen Susan collapse. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Susan tried to remain professional, staying with Emma at the children's table, but Cox kept finding reasons to check on them. Dance with me, Emma demanded during a slow song. And Susan obliged, twirling the little girl and making her laugh loud enough that people stared. May I cut in? Cox appeared beside them, and Emma pushed Susan toward him with surprising force. Dance with Daddy, she commanded. He never dances anymore. Suddenly Susan found herself in Cox's arms, acutely aware of his hand on her waist, the way he smelled like cedar, and something uniquely him. I'm sorry about Emma, he murmured. She's gotten it into her head that you and I. He trailed off, embarrassed. Susan's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could feel it. Children have wild imaginations, she managed to say, even as she wondered if Emma was the only one imagining things. It happened 3 months after Susan arrived, on an ordinary Tuesday that became extraordinary. Emma was at a sleepover, her first since her mother's death, and Cox had insisted Susan take the night off. She'd been organizing the guest house library when he appeared at her door with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. Thought you might be hungry, he said, looking boyish and uncertain. They ate on the floor of her living room, talking about everything and nothing. Cox told her about building his company from one delivery truck, about the wife he'd loved and lost, about the fear that he was failing Emma. Susan shared her own losses, the teaching career derailed by family obligations, the dreams deferred and nearly forgotten. When he kissed her, it was soft and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She kissed him back like she was drowning and he was air, like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment, this man, this unexpected second chance at everything. Susan woke alone, which shouldn't have surprised her but did. The indent on the pillow beside her and the note on the nightstand were the only evidence that last night had been real. Had to pick up Emma. We need to talk. See, the formal initial felt like a step backward, and Susan's stomach churned with familiar dread. She'd crossed a line, probably lost her job, definitely complicated everything. But when Cox returned with Emma, who was chattering about her sleepover, he caught Susan's eye over his daughter's head and smiled. That private, real smile that made her knees weak. Emma wants pancakes, he said. Mind if we invade your kitchen? As Emma ran ahead, he caught Susan's hand, squeezing it gently. We're okay, he whispered. More than okay, but we need to be careful. For Emma. Susan nodded, understanding. Emma had already lost one mother. She couldn't lose someone else she'd grown attached to if things didn't work out. They became masters of stolen moments. A brush of hands when passing in the hallway. Kisses in the pantry while Emma practiced piano. Late-night texts that made Susan smile into her pillow. Cox would find excuses to work from home, setting up his laptop where he could watch Susan and Emma in the garden, teaching her about plants and patience. Emma, for her part, seemed happier than she'd been in years, though she watched them both with knowing eyes that reminded Susan that children saw more than adults gave them credit for. "Susan makes you smile," Emma announced one dinner, making both adults freeze. "Mom would like that. She told me before she went to heaven that she wanted you to smile again." Cox's eyes filled with tears. He quickly blinked away. "Did she?" he asked softly. Emma nodded solemnly. "She said love was too good to waste." The simplicity of it, the permission from beyond, broke something open in the room. Cox reached for Susan's hand across the table, and this time he didn't let go. Veronica Ashwood arrived on a Thursday, all red lips and perfect hair, looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Cox's ex-girlfriend from before his marriage, she'd heard about his wife's passing and come to offer comfort. She took one look at Susan in her simple sundress and dismissed her entirely. "How wonderful that you found good help," she purred, pressing herself against Cox in a hug that lasted too long. Susan watched Cox's discomfort with a mixture of sympathy and something else, something that felt dangerously like jealousy. "Veronica, this is Susan," Cox said firmly. "She's not the help, she's—" He paused, and Susan held her breath. "She's family," Emma announced, appearing from nowhere and wrapping her arms around Susan's waist. "And we don't need any more family right now, thank you." The look on Veronica's face was priceless, but the look on Cox's, proud and amused and full of love, was everything. "I should tell you something," Susan said one night as they sat on her porch watching fireflies. "I know you think I didn't know who you were when we met, but I did. I mean, I figured it out at the hospital." She took a breath. "I took the job because I was desperate. Yes, but also because I wanted to know what it was like, to not worry about money for once." Cox was quiet for so long she thought she'd ruined everything. Then he laughed, soft and surprised. "I should tell you something too," he said. "The shipping fortune? It's real, but it's not inherited. I built it from nothing. My dad was a truck driver, my mom a waitress. That suit I was wearing when we met? I'd bought it that morning for a board meeting where they still look at me like I don't belong." He turned to her. "So I understand wanting security. The question is, what do you want now?" Emma's campaign to make them a real family began in earnest after Veronica's visit. She started leaving wedding magazines around the house, open to specific pages. She asked Susan to teach her how to braid hair for when you're my real mom. She told every teacher, parent, and grocery store clerk that her daddy had a girlfriend. Cox and Susan tried to have a serious conversation with her about boundaries and taking things slow, but Emma just rolled her eyes. "You adults make everything so complicated," she said with the wisdom of someone who'd seen too much too young. "Mom got sick, and we only had 3 years together." 3 years? That's not enough time. So why are you wasting the time you have? The logic was hard to argue with, even if it came from a 7-year-old. That night, Cox showed up at Susan's door with a ring box. Inside was not an engagement ring, but a key. "Move in with us," he said. "Into the main house. Into our lives." Officially, the guest house had been Susan's sanctuary, her own space in a world where she'd had so little control. Packing it up felt like closing a chapter she wasn't quite ready to end. Cox and Emma helped, though Emma mostly provided commentary and occasionally hugged items she deemed too important to box. "This is where you were reading when I first decided I liked you," she announced, pointing to a chair. "And this is where Daddy kissed you when he thought I was asleep. But I totally wasn't." Both adults froze. "Emma Catherine Willer," Cox started, but Emma just grinned. "What?" It was gross, but also kind of nice. Like when the princess and the frog kiss in the movie, except nobody turned into anything. Although, I guess Susan kind of turned into my mom, so maybe. Susan scooped her up, tickling her to stop the rambling. "I'm not trying to be your mom," she said when Emma caught her breath. "I'm just trying to be someone who loves you." Emma's face went serious. "That's what moms do. They love you." It started over something stupid. Cox had made a decision about Emma's education without consulting Susan, enrolling her in an elite private school for the next year. "I'm her father," he said, defensive in that way powerful men got when challenged. "I've been making these decisions for 7 years. Susan felt the words like a slap. "And what am I?" she asked quietly. "The nanny who shares your bed?" The hurt in her voice stopped him cold. That's not what I meant." But the damage was done. Susan retreated to what had been her guest house, now empty except for the furniture. Cox found her there an hour later, Emma in tow. "Tell her," Emma demanded, pushing her father forward. "Tell her what you told me." Cox knelt in front of Susan, taking her hands. "You're not the nanny. You haven't been for a long time. You're the woman I love. The woman Emma loves. I'm scared of replacing what Emma's lost. Of making decisions that include you. Because that makes it real. And real things can be lost." It wasn't how either of them had imagined it. Emma had the stomach flu. Susan was covered in vomit, and Cox had been up for 36 hours straight with a crisis at the company. They were all crowded in Emma's bathroom at 3 a.m. when Cox suddenly said, "Marry me." Susan, who was rinsing a washcloth, froze. "What?" Even Emma, miserable as she was, perked up. "I know this isn't romantic," Cox continued, exhaustion making him honest. "But this is our life, messy and imperfect and real. And I don't want to do it with anyone else. You make the hard parts bearable and the good parts better. Emma loves you, I love you. So marry me. Please." Susan looked at him, disheveled, exhausted, holding their sick child, and saw forever. "Yes," she said simply. Emma, despite her nausea, managed a week finally, before they had to turn back to the toilet. The news of their engagement spread through Cox's social circle like wildfire. Some were thrilled, those who'd seen how happy he'd become. Others were skeptical, whispering about gold diggers and inappropriate employer-employee relationships. Susan tried not to let it bother her, but it was hard when she overheard 2 women at Emma's school talking about how that nanny certainly worked fast. Cox's response was to throw an engagement party that nobody could ignore. He invited everyone, from his board of directors to Susan's family, who were still in shock that she was marrying a billionaire. "Let them talk," he said, pulling her close as they watched the party preparations. "They talked when I was new money. They talked when Margaret got sick. They'll always talk. What matters is us." Emma, wearing a shirt that said "I planned this," served as unofficial hostess, telling everyone how she'd known from the start that Susan was perfect for them. Susan's family arrived for the engagement party like a hurricane of questions and barely concealed amazement. Her mother kept touching things as if to verify they were real. Her younger siblings took selfies in every room. Her father, who'd reappeared after hearing about her engagement, tried to act like he'd never left. The contrast between her chaotic family and Cox's orderly world was stark and uncomfortable. But Cox surprised her. He charmed her mother, talked sports with her brothers, and even managed to be civil to her father. Emma appointed herself as tour guide, showing off our house with pride. when Susan's mother pulled her aside and asked if this was what she really wanted. Susan could answer honestly. "He sees me," she said. "Not the poor girl, not the desperate woman who fainted on the street, but me. And I see him, not the billionaire, but the single dad who's just trying to do his best." Emma took charge of wedding planning with the determination of a general preparing for battle. She had binders, color-coded tabs, and strong opinions about everything from flowers to food. Small and intimate, she declared, overruling the wedding planner Cox had hired. Mom's wedding was big and fancy, and she said it was exhausting. This should be about family. Susan found herself falling more in love with both of them daily. Cox, who could have insisted on a society wedding, backed Emma completely. They settled on a garden ceremony at the estate, with only their closest friends and family. Susan's wedding dress was simple but elegant, chosen by Emma, who declared it perfectly Susan. The only moment of tension came when Cox's board suggested a prenuptial agreement. Cox's response was to laugh. "I'm marrying a woman who tried to leave the hospital without treatment because she couldn't afford it. If she wanted my money, she's terrible at showing it." The night before the wedding, Susan couldn't sleep. She wandered the house, soon to be officially her house, and found Cox in his study, also awake. "Second thoughts?" he asked, though his voice betrayed his worry. Susan shook her head, moving to sit in his lap, something she would never have dared months ago. "Just thinking about how far we've come. 6 months ago, I was homeless. Now I'm marrying the man I love, becoming mother to an amazing girl." "Stepmother," Cox corrected gently, but Susan shook her head. "Emma informed me that step is just a word for people who don't understand that love makes a family, not blood." Cox's eyes misted. "She's too smart for 7. They sat in comfortable silence until Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Is it tomorrow yet?" she asked. "Almost, baby," Cox said, opening his arms so she could join them. They stayed like that until dawn, a family before the paperwork made it official. The wedding was perfect in its imperfection. It rained, just as Susan started down the aisle, sending everyone scrambling for the tent. Emma, who was both flower girl and self-appointed wedding coordinator, declared it good luck. "Rain means the flowers will grow," she announced with 7-year-old authority. Susan's dress got muddy at the hem, Cox's hair curled in the humidity, and the cake started sliding in the heat that followed the rain. But when Cox said his vows, his voice breaking as he promised to love her through every storm, Susan couldn't imagine anything more perfect. Emma stood between them, holding both their hands as they were pronounced a family. The kiss was interrupted by Emma declaring, "Finally! Now can we eat cake?" The laughter that followed was better than any orchestrated moment could have been. A traditional honeymoon was out of the question. Emma had made it clear that 2 weeks without them was unacceptable. So they compromised. A family trip to Disney World, with the promise of alone time, while Emma enjoyed the kids' clubs. It wasn't the romantic getaway Cox had initially planned, but watching Susan and Emma meet the princesses, both of them equally starry-eyed, he couldn't imagine anything better. "This is better than a real honeymoon," Susan said one evening as they watched Emma sleep, exhausted from the day's adventures. "Because this is real life, our life." Cox pulled her onto the balcony of their hotel room, the fireworks from the park visible in the distance. "Mrs. Willer," he said, still testing out the words, "you've turned me into someone who chooses Disney World over Paris." Susan laughed. "Is that a complaint?" He kissed her in response, deep and sure. Never. Coming home from the honeymoon meant returning to real life and its complications. Cox's company was in the middle of a major acquisition, requiring long hours and constant travel. Susan officially adopted her role as Emma's mother, which meant PTA meetings, school projects, and navigating the complex social dynamics of being the former nanny who married the boss. Some mothers welcomed her warmly. Others maintained a cool distance that made school pickup uncomfortable. Emma, oblivious to or simply uncaring about the social dynamics, introduced Susan to everyone as my mom with fierce pride. When one particularly snobby mother made a comment about knowing one's place, Emma responded with, "My mom knows her place. It's with us. Where's your place? In other people's business." The 7-year-old mic drop left Susan mortified and secretly proud. Cox laughed for 10 minutes when he heard the story. The call came at 2 a.m. One of Cox's cargo ships had run aground, spilling contents into the ocean. It was an environmental disaster, a PR nightmare, and potentially the end of everything he'd built. Cox was on a plane within an hour, and Susan watched him go with a heavy heart. This was the part of his life she couldn't share, couldn't help with, could only wait through. Emma climbed into bed with her that night. "Daddy fixes things," she said with complete confidence. "That's what he does." Susan held her close, wishing she had a 7-year-old's faith. The next weeks were brutal. Cox barely home. Media camped outside their gates, accusations flying. Susan did the only thing she could. She held down the fort, kept Emma stable, and waited. When Cox finally came home, exhausted but victorious after containing the damage, he collapsed into Susan's arms. "You," he said into her hair, "are my anchor." Susan had been feeling off for weeks, which she attributed to stress from the business crisis. But when the nausea didn't pass and exhaustion became overwhelming, she finally took a test. Then another. Then 3 more, all with the same result. She was pregnant. The timing was terrible. Cox was still dealing with the acquisition fallout. Emma had just started adjusting to their new family dynamic. But as Susan stared at the positive tests, she felt nothing but joy. She told Cox first, finding him in his study at midnight, still working. "I need to tell you something," she said, and he immediately tensed, probably expecting more bad news. She handed him the test. He stared at it for so long she started to worry. Then he was out of his chair, lifting her, spinning her, laughing and crying simultaneously. "A baby?" he kept saying. "We're having a baby?" Emma's reaction the next morning was even better, finally. "I've been asking for a sibling since I was 4. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Morning sickness lasted all day, and Susan's history of malnutrition meant she was high risk. Bed rest was ordered by week 20, turning Susan from active mother and wife to frustrated patient. Emma appointed herself as chief caretaker, bringing books, snacks, and constant commentary about what the baby was probably thinking. Cox worked from home as much as possible, conducting board meetings from their bedroom so Susan could listen. "I hate this," Susan admitted one particularly hard day. "I went from taking care of everyone to being helpless." Cox sat beside her, his hand on her swollen belly. "You're growing our child," he said firmly. "That's the opposite of helpless. That's the most powerful thing in the world," Emma added. "Plus, you're teaching me that sometimes even strong people need help." Mom never wanted to admit she needed help. The comparison to his first wife was rare from Emma, and it made them all quiet, remembering that joy could exist alongside grief. Emma and Cox's assistant planned a baby shower that was part fairy tale, part Emma's unique sensibility. There were traditional games, but also advice for the baby station where Emma had written, "Don't eat the dog food, no matter how good it looks, and your big sister is always right." Susan's family came, still somewhat overwhelmed by the world Susan now inhabited, but trying. Her mother cried when she saw the nursery, decorated in soft yellows and greens. The surprise was Cox's appearance. Men didn't typically attend baby showers in their circle, but he walked in with a gift that made Susan cry, a photo album titled "Your Story," starting with a newspaper clipping about a woman who collapsed on the street and was helped by a stranger through their wedding to ultrasound photos. "Every good story needs a beginning," he said, kissing her forehead. "This is ours." At 32 weeks, Susan woke to contractions. The rush to the hospital was a blur of Cox's white knuckles on the steering wheel and Emma's scared face in the rearview mirror. "It's too early," Susan kept saying, terror making her voice high. The baby couldn't come now. Not when they weren't ready, not when there was so much that could go wrong. But after hours of monitoring and medication, the contractions stopped. False labor, the doctor said, common but scary. They returned home subdued, the reality of how quickly everything could change sitting heavy. Emma crawled into their bed that night, her hand on Susan's belly. "Stay in there, baby," she whispered. "We're not ready to share Mom yet." Cox wrapped around them both, his family cocooned in his arms, safe for now. When real labor started at 38 weeks, Susan was calm. She'd been having contractions all day, but didn't want to worry anyone after the false alarm. It wasn't until her water broke during Emma's piano recital that panic set in. Cox carried her to the car, while Emma ran alongside, still in her recital dress, shouting, "The baby's coming! My sibling is coming!" 20 hours of labor tested everyone. Cox never left her side, letting her crush his hand through contractions. Emma was sent to the waiting room but snuck back repeatedly, needing to check on Susan. When the baby finally arrived, a boy with Cox's dark hair and Susan's honey eyes, the room erupted in tears. "A brother," Emma breathed, touching his tiny hand. "I got a brother." They'd avoided naming discussions, each having different ideas. Cox wanted something traditional, Susan something meaningful, and Emma had a list that included dragon and lightning Meki Queen. But looking at their son, the name came easily. "Thomas," Susan said, after Cox's father who'd passed the year before. "Thomas Miguel," adding her own father's name, despite their complicated relationship. "Thomas Miguel Willer," Cox said, testing it out. "It's perfect. He's perfect." Emma, holding her brother for the first time with careful, supervised arms, declared, "I'm going to call him Tommy and teach him everything. Important stuff, like how to sneak cookies and why Mom's hugs are the best, and how Daddy's actually a softie, even though he tries to look tough in meetings." Cox pretended to be offended while Susan laughed, then winced. Laughing hurt everything. Bringing Tommy home shifted their family dynamic again. Emma was helpful but jealous of the attention the baby required. Susan was exhausted, healing, and struggling with the baby blues no one had warned her about. Cox was trying to balance a demanding company with a family that needed him more than ever. The perfect family photos they'd imagined were replaced by spit-up stained shirts and arguments about whose turn it was for night feeding. "This is hard," Susan said one night, crying as Tommy refused to latch properly. "Why did no one say it would be this hard?" Cox took the baby, giving her a break. "Because everyone pretends it's magical all the time. But Susan, look." He gestured to Emma, who'd fallen asleep on the floor by the baby's bassinet. Guard duty, she called it. "It's hard and magical. Both things can be true." He was right, of course. When Tommy finally latched and Emma stirred, mumbling about protecting her brother, Susan felt the magic through the exhaustion. 6 months into Tommy's life, Veronica returned. This time she came with a business proposition. Her father's company wanted to partner with Cox's. She was professional, appropriate, but Susan saw the way she looked at Cox, at their life, with something like regret. "You have a beautiful family," she said, and it sounded sincere. "I had my chance, didn't I? Before Margaret. I chose my career." Susan surprised herself by feeling sympathy. "Choices make us," she said simply. "Different choices, different lives." Later, Cox told her the partnership was good business, but he'd only proceed if Susan was comfortable. "She's the past," Susan said. "I'm not threatened by the past anymore." She meant it. How could she be threatened when Cox looked at her like she hung the moon, when Emma called her mom without hesitation, when Tommy reached for her first? Emma's 8th birthday brought unexpected tears. "I can't remember Mom's voice," she confessed to Susan, sobbing in a way she hadn't in months. "I try, but it's gone. What kind of daughter forgets her mother's voice?" Susan held her, fighting her own tears. This was the complexity of their family. Joy and grief intertwined, love that didn't erase what came before. Cox found them there and joined the embrace. "I have videos," he said quietly. "I haven't watched them because it hurt too much. But maybe it's time." They spent the evening watching old videos. Margaret reading to baby Emma, singing lullabies, saying "I love you" over and over. Emma cried, Cox cried, Susan cried, and even Tommy seemed subdued. "She was beautiful," Susan said, and meant it. "You look just like her when you smile." "Emma." Emma leaned into her. "She would have liked you," she said. "She would have liked that Daddy's happy again." The letter came from a law firm Susan had never heard of. Her estranged grandmother, who she'd thought died years ago, had left her something. The meeting at the lawyer's office revealed a surprise. Not money, but a small farmhouse in Montana fully paid for and a letter. "For my granddaughter who was brave enough to leave," it read. "Every woman needs something that's just hers." Cox encouraged her to visit it, even offered to buy it from her if she wanted to sell. But standing in the old farmhouse, seeing the care her grandmother had maintained it with, Susan knew she'd keep it. "It's our escape," she told Cox. "Somewhere Emma and Tommy can run wild, where you don't have to be a CEO, where I don't have to be anyone, but Susan—" They spent that summer fixing it up, Emma painting flowers on the shutters, Tommy taking his first steps in the overgrown garden. Susan's father had been hovering at the edges of their life since the wedding. Never fully absent, but never fully present either. It was Tommy who changed things, reaching for his grandfather with chubby arms, not knowing the complicated history. Watching her father hold her son, Susan saw him differently. Older, grayer, weighted by regret. "I left because I was scared," he admitted one day. "Your mother was sick, we were drowning in debt, and I was a coward. I told myself, you kids would be better off without me." Susan wanted to stay angry, but Emma chose that moment to run in, asking her grandfather to teach her Spanish. Watching him carefully sound out words with Emma, Susan made a choice. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she told Cox that night. "Even the people who hurt us." Cox kissed her temple. "That's why you're the heart of this family." Tommy's first birthday coincided with Cox's company going public, a massive undertaking that required road shows, investor meetings, and weeks of absence. Susan managed the household, but the strain showed. Emma started acting out at school, Tommy went through sleep regression, and Susan felt like she was drowning in responsibilities that money couldn't solve. The breaking point came when Cox missed Tommy's first birthday party due to a delayed flight. Emma's accusatory, "You're turning into one of those dads," hit him like a slap. He flew home on the red-eye, finding Susan asleep in Tommy's room, tear tracks on her face. "I'm failing you," he said when she woke. "No," she corrected. "We're struggling. There's a difference. But something has to change." They hired more help. Cox stepped back from 2 board positions, and Susan started seeing a therapist for the anxiety she'd been hiding. Balance, they learned, was a constant negotiation. The article in the Kentucky Times should have been a puff piece about successful local families. But the journalist had done her homework, connecting dots that created a different narrative. From homeless to housewife, The Cinderella story, that's not what it seems, suggested Susan had orchestrated her collapse, targeted Cox specifically, manipulated a grieving child. It was cruel, untrue, and devastating. Emma came home from school in tears. Kids were saying her mom was a gold digger. Cox's lawyers wanted to sue, but Susan stopped them. "We respond with truth," she said. At the school's next assembly, Susan stood up and told her story. The full story. The hunger, the desperation, the miracle of being caught when she fell. "I didn't chase a fortune," she concluded. "I was offered a job, found a family, and fell in love. If that makes me calculating, then I'm guilty of calculating that love matters more than pride." The standing ovation was led by Emma, but it was Cox's tears that meant the most. The offer came through Emma's school. They needed a new head of the arts program, someone with Susan's background in education and her newfound understanding of privilege and need. It would mean real work, her own identity beyond wife and mother. Cox was thrilled. Emma excited about her mom being at school, but Susan hesitated. She'd been out of the workforce so long, and now with 2 children. "You saved me," Cox said simply. "Let me return the favor. Take the job. We'll make it work." They did. Susan revolutionized the arts program, bringing in students from underfunded schools, creating partnerships that bridged economic divides. Emma became her unofficial assistant, and Tommy charmed board members from his stroller. "You're not just Mrs. Willer," one teacher said. "You're Susan Martinez Willer, and that hyphen represents everything you've brought to this place." The call came on a Tuesday. A young woman had collapsed near the Beaumont Gallery, unconscious and alone. Cox heard about it from his driver and immediately went to the hospital. She was 19, pregnant, recently homeless after aging out of foster care. The parallels to Susan's story were unmistakable. Cox called Susan from the hospital. "We're helping her," he said. It wasn't a question. They did more than help. They hired her as an assistant in the arts program, set her up in the guest house, became her support system as she navigated single motherhood. "Why?" the girl, Amy, asked Susan one day. "Because someone caught me when I fell," Susan said simply. "Now I'm catching you." Emma appointed herself as Amy's guide to the Willer family chaos. "Rule 1, she said seriously. "In this family, we choose each other every day. 5 years of marriage deserve something special," Cox declared. But Susan had learned that their best moments were rarely the planned ones. So when Cox arranged an elaborate anniversary party, Susan wasn't surprised when everything went wrong. The caterer cancelled, it rained, and Tommy managed to cover himself in mud minutes before guests arrived. But then Emma took charge, ordering pizza for everyone, turning the formal garden party into an impromptu picnic. Guests ended up barefoot in the grass. Tommy's muddy handprints became part of the decoration, and Cox's board members learned to play Emma's invented games. "This," Cox said, pulling Susan close as they watched their controlled chaos, "is perfect," Susan agreed. Their love story had never been conventional. Why should their anniversary be? The headache started subtly, just enough for Susan to pop ibuprofen and continue. But when she collapsed again, this time in her own kitchen, the fear in Cox's eyes was familiar. The hospital, the tests, the waiting, it all felt like a cruel echo of their beginning. Emma sat rigid in the waiting room, 8 going on 40, holding Tommy's hand too tight. The diagnosis was better than feared. Severe anemia and exhaustion. Treatable but serious. "You can't pour from an egg," the doctor lectured. Susan wanted to laugh at the cliché, but saw her family's faces and realized she'd been so busy taking care of everyone else, she'd forgotten herself. The next months were about learning balance. Emma making sure she ate, Cox enforcing rest times, Tommy bringing her books and patting her face with sticky hands. Being cared for, she learned, was its own form of love. Tommy was 3 when they started discussing another child. Emma, now 11 and full of preteen wisdom, had a "Only if you actually take care of yourself this time," she said sternly. The fertility journey at Susan's age wasn't easy. Tests, treatments, disappointments. Cox offered to stop, saying their family was already perfect, but Susan wasn't ready to give up. "I want to give you everything," he said one night after another negative test. "You've already given me everything," Susan replied, "but I want this too. One more piece of our story." It took 2 years, multiple rounds of IVF, and more tears than Susan could count. But when the test finally showed positive, when the ultrasound showed twins, Emma's whoop of joy could probably be heard in space. "I asked for 1 sibling and got 3, she announced. "I'm very efficient." The twins came early, as twins do, turning a routine checkup into emergency delivery. Cox was in Boston, Emma at school, and Susan was alone when the doctor said, "We need to deliver now." The fear was different this time. Not for herself, but for the babies who weren't quite ready. For Cox, who would miss it. For Emma, who'd planned to be there. But life, Susan had learned, rarely followed plans. The twins, Rose and James, arrived screaming and perfect, while Cox was somewhere over Ohio, racing home. Emma burst into the hospital room, still in her school uniform. Tommy on her hip, he'd been picked up from daycare by Amy, their former houseguest turned family friend. "They're here," Emma cried. "My siblings are here." When Cox finally arrived, wild-eyed and breathless, he found his family complete, chaotic, loud, and absolutely perfect. People often ask Susan about her fairy tale life, the rags-to-riches story that seemed too perfect to be real. But sitting in her kitchen at 3 a.m., Rose crying, James needing a diaper change, Tommy having a nightmare, and Emma stress-baking for a school project, Susan knew the truth. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. Cox appeared, taking Rose so Susan could handle James. Emma pulled cookies from the oven while discussing her history project. Tommy climbed into Susan's lap despite the baby already there. This was their fairy tale. Messy, exhausting, overwhelming, and absolutely worth every moment. "I love our chaos," Cox said, reading her mind as he often did. "I love our everything," Susan replied, meaning it completely. The guest house had been converted into Emma's teen sanctuary when she turned 14, a place for independence while staying close. Susan stood in it now, remembering that first day when Cox had shown her around, when she'd been grateful just for a roof and a chance. Now she was watching Emma, 16 and fierce, preparing for her own future. "Tell me again," Emma said, working on her college essays. "Tell me about the day you collapsed." Susan had told this story countless times, but Emma never tired of it. "I fell," Susan began, "and your father caught me." "But really, we caught each other." Emma smiled, typing rapidly. "I'm writing about chosen families," she explained. "About how love isn't about blood or money or convenience. It's about choosing to hold on when letting go would be easier." The vow renewal was Emma's idea, planned for Cox and Susan's 10th anniversary. "You're different people now," she explained with teenage logic. "You should promise different things." She wasn't wrong. The Susan who'd collapsed on that street wouldn't recognize the woman she'd become. Mother of 4, director of a thriving arts program, wife to a man who still looked at her like she hung the moon. Cox's new vows made everyone cry. 10 years ago, I promised to love you in sickness and health. Now I promise to love you in chaos and calm, in teenagers and toddlers, in 3 a.m. feedings and board meetings. Susan's were simpler. You caught me when I fell. You catch me still every day. I promise to keep falling, knowing you'll be there. Emma officiated. She'd gotten ordained online. The twins threw flowers with enthusiasm, if not accuracy. And Tommy played a piano piece he'd been practicing for months. As Susan looked around, at her children, her husband, the friends who'd become family, the family who'd learned to accept their unconventional story, she realized this was what happily ever after really looked like. Not perfect, but perfectly theirs. She'd collapsed on a street in Kentucky and woken up to a life she never could have imagined. And every morning when Cox brought her coffee and the kids piled into their bed for family cuddle time, Emma's invention that even her teenage self couldn't give up, Susan knew the truth. She was still waking up in the arms of the man who'd saved her, and she was still saving him right back, one beautifully chaotic day at a time. Love stories aren't about perfect people finding perfect situations. They're about imperfect people choosing each other, again and again, through every challenge life throws their way. Susan and Cox's story began with a fall, but it continues with the daily choice to rise together. And that's the end of today's story. Now I want to hear from you. What lesson did this story leave with you? Drop your answer below. I can't wait to read them all. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly stories. Until next time, keep shining and stay blessed.